I will be right with you. Okay, live streaming. Very good. Okay. Okay, so we left off last time. Daniel had been brought in before the king. The king had offered him the same deal that he had offered the other soothsayers, fortune tellers, whatever, that if he could read this thing, this inscription on the wall and explain what it meant, that he would dress him in the royal garb and give him this royal necklet around his neck, and he would be given a third of the kingdom to rule. Sounds somewhat like the Esther story, right? Up to half of the kingdom in that case. But Daniel says, you can keep your gifts, not interested. And he also says to the, I'm gonna share my text. Which text do I want to share? This one. And Daniel, go ahead.
I wanted to ask the question, why is Daniel named as Daniel, even after, I have a problem here, after so many years, and not Belshazzar? Why did the text use his Hebrew name and not the Babylonian name?
Wow. Okay. So there are a number of reasons. One is Daniel himself always thought of himself as Daniel. So in places where this is his text, so in places where he's talking about himself, he's going to call himself Daniel. But even back with Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel says, my name is Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar says, but we call you Belshazzar. It's okay. Daniel, who's also known as Belshazzar, or Belshazzar, but who's also known as his Jewish name of Daniel. There was never a complete replacement of the name, as far as I can tell. Because we've been seeing it through the chapters. And now we're, a generation or two later, the queen mother is the one, if I go up earlier, right? The queen mother was the one who told her son, if you're looking for somebody, I need to get a new computer. And I will fairly soon. So I'm going back up in the text to find it. So the queen heard these words, and she came and she said to the king, you should live forever. Don't be so scared, right? Your face shouldn't change. There is this man, right? Itai Gavar b'malchutach. There's this man in your kingdom, Diruach Elokim Kadishin Be, that the spirit of the Holy God is upon him. Ubiyome avuch nehiru v'shaklutanu v'chachma kachachma delakin hishtakachat be. And in the days of your ancestor, it was his clarity and his incisiveness and his wisdom was like the wisdom of God. This divine wisdom was found to be within him. Malka Nebuchadnezzar avuch, Rav Chartumin, Ashrin, Kastin, Gazrin, Hekime avuch Malka. And Nebuchadnezzar, your ancestor, made him the chief of all of the soothsayers, fortune tellers, necromancers of the Kasdim, and of all the various different kinds of. Gazrin was yet a different kind of worker with supernatural kinds of things. And he established him, your father, the king, your ancestor, the king, established him to be in charge. Okay. She hasn't named him yet. And then she says, so he has this extra wisdom, et cetera, et cetera. And then she says, it's all found Daniel. It's all found in Daniel. That was his name. That's how he called himself. I don't think he ever gave up on calling himself that. And then she says, "The Malka Sam Shmei Belshazzar," that the king gave him an additional name of Belshazzar, which we were told was the name of one of the Babylonian types of avodah zarah. And so, I mean, it's clear that he's not actually, well, I'm assuming they understood that he wasn't a living embodiment of their God. But his private name was Daniel, and being called Belshazzar was because he was on this divine level, I think, is what was going on. And so Khan Daniel Yitkare. So now you should have Daniel called here, Upisha Yehacheve, and he'll he'll explain the solution to this writing that's on the wall. So I think the deal is that he insisted on it. Had he given in to that change of name, and had he ever referred to himself that way, I think it would have been a very different story. But Nebuchadnezzar himself kept saying, Daniel, whom I have given this extra name to, as though the name that this name Belshazzar that was given to him was almost more of a title than a private name. I mean, that's the way it feels to me. I will look and see if I can find anybody who speaks to that. I don't remember seeing it. We can go look right now, actually, at the Pirushim. Sfari is wonderful, to see if anybody tries to explain that. I don't know. Rashi? No. I've seen these now. I read through most of these at one point or another. And so Al-Sheikh I might not have seen before. Don't think Malbim asked a question on that. Here he's talking about that part of the pasuk. Okay, basically what I said to you is here in this Malbim. That's what I thought, but okay. He says, so let Daniel be called and he'll tell you the solution. But also in the, according to Malbim, in that phrase, there's another intent there, not just that surface intent. Because Nebuchadnezzar had given him the name Belshazzar, like the name of his God. And also the Melech Nikra B'Shem HaKavod Hazeh, and the king was called, also was given, this was from the perspective of Nebuchadnezzar, this was, the king. No, he's not talking about Nebuchadnezzar. the king Belshazzar, even though it's not spelled with the tet, this descendant of Nebuchadnezzar is also called with this same name of kavod. ומאז הומלך בלשצר, לא ייתכן שיקרא איש אחר בשם הכבוד של המלך. And from the time that Belshazzar was crowned king, it wouldn't be appropriate that anybody else should be called by this same name as the king. Okay? I mean, it's like, I have a bit of an issue. My downstairs neighbors have a dog. They call their dog Debbie. One of my very best friends and teachers' name is Debbie. I have an issue with the fact that there's the dog and this Talmidah Chachama, okay, Chasidah Mamash, who are called by the same name. It's not kavadik. Okay, it's like, call the dog Spot. I mean, whatever. Call the dog a dog's name. Don't call the dog by a person's name. So the Malbim here is, so he's giving a different answer than what I gave. The first answer I gave was already there, but this is a different answer that he's given. And he's saying, so it's not appropriate that once Belshazzar is the king, that Daniel should be called by the same name as the king. So, therefore, let him be called Daniel. Let him go back to his original name. He should be called by the name Daniel and not by the name Belshazzar, because it shouldn't. She'ein ze mazik lo lechachmato shebachol ze pishri yachabe, and he won't take it. He won't take it as an insult. You know, he'll understand why you're not calling him by his Babylonian name. To be honest, he's probably going to be very happy that you're not calling him by his Babylonian name. But he won't take it as an insult. He'll still tell you, okay? Let him be called Daniel, and he'll still tell you the solution to what you need. It's not going to take away from his chachma by his no longer being called by this divine name, this Avodah Zorah type divine name, isn't going to take away from his chachma, because really and truly his chachma doesn't come from that Avodah Zorah, right? His chachma comes from Akash Baruch Hu. So you can call him Daniel, which has the name Kael in it, right? Has God's name in it. God is my judge. So that's a very nice answer, actually, to the question that you asked. There were a couple other things that you and I talked about after we turned off the Zoom last week. Do you remember what they were? You're muted.
I was thinking about it, but I forgot. Sorry.
Okay. I should have written it down. My bad. Yeah.
When we continue. I mean, that Daniel didn't change his name. Okay. But
that they still knew what his other name was.
But the king's mother should, and there is one letter difference. So maybe there is a hint to something. I thought maybe there's something.
Well, I don't know whether it could just be spelling things always the same way is a fairly modern invention. Mm-hmm. It could be that, basically the two names are the same name. And I try to make a very strong pronunciation. I try to strongly pronounce that tet in order to distinguish between them. But if you're speaking quickly, those two names sound the same. Belshazzar, like it's the same name. It's named after the same allele. And so it makes sense with the Malbim. That's the Malbim suggestion. It makes sense. So it's not proper that anybody else should be called by that name. So seeing as he has another name besides this one, and we can go for that.
I'm wondering if the name appears his Babylonian name appears later. Or if he,
What do you mean?
I'm not sure. I have no idea if Daniel got named by the name Belshazzar from the
Right. So
Babylonian.
that name,
Or
what's interesting to me about that is that the Queen Mother says it was Nebuchadnezzar who gave him that name. And and Nebuchadnezzar himself says, I gave you the name of my God.
Yes.
Okay. In the previous chapter. But I think that if we go back up, so today's a fun day to just sort of play around because we have a short amount. We do need to finish chapter 5 today, but we'll go back and take a look at some things. So let's go all the way back up to chapter 1, because I believe my recollection was that in chapter 1, which is in Hebrew, not in Aramaic, be nice.
So I'm going to look ahead. If he's named again Belshazzar.
Well, he might be, but the point is, the question is where did the name act? Here it is. So this is what's interesting, is that the Queen Mother says that Nebuchadnezzar gave him the name Belshazzar. And
yes,
Nebuchadnezzar himself in chapter 4 says, I gave you the name Belshazzar. Because why? Because you have this divine wisdom, and so I named you like one of my gods. But here is the verse in chapter 1 that I was remembering, which is that the Sar HaSarisim gave them names to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Okay? They were in this school for potential courtiers. Okay? Potential officers of the court. And he, not clear, wanted to make them, I mean, the Mefarshim give some suggestions there, actually, that, maybe he wanted to make, to help them to assimilate, give them a name that sounded more normal in the Babylonian language, right. Or he wanted to, he wanted to sort of help them hide their Jewish origins. They shouldn't look too different from everybody else. So we had a variety of reasons as to why. What was the purpose of the Sarasarisim? Was it to force them to assimilate, denying them their name, telling you can't speak Hebrew amongst yourselves? You have to. In other words, was there an attempt like? I mean, I don't know as much about the history in Europe, but in Canada and in the United States, the Native Americans were forced into these mission schools and were not allowed to speak their own language. Actually happened also to the Irish under the English at one point. They weren't allowed to speak Irish, and that they had to use English, and etc. That there's an attempt to deny people their history by taking away their names, by taking away their language, taking away their native dress, etc. So was this an attempt to erase their connection to the Jewish people by giving them different names? Or was it just an attempt to make them more acceptable in the eyes of other people, and that they still kept both sets of names? It's clear that amongst themselves that they did keep their own names. But this pasuk here says already that it was the Sarasarisim who gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar. And Hananiah, he gave the name Shadrach, and to Mishael, he gave the name Meshach, and to Azariah, he gave the name Abednego. And there are Meforshim here. So the name Rashi right away on the name Belshazzar. And I remember seeing this and going the first time through. It was like, how does Rashi know that this is a name of Avodah Zarah? Like, where did that come from? Well, it comes from in chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar says explicitly that this is the name of one of the Avodah Zarah. But it's like, what? What's going on? And he's called. And then, and Rashi actually takes the name apart. He says it was the name of one of the type of idol worship of Bavel that was called Bel, like Baal, in a sense. Shene'amar dishmei Belteshazzar kashum Elokai. That's what Nebuchadnezzar said. That's how. And Belteshazzar was the shame of the lashon of Chachma in Lashon Arami. So it's like the master of wisdom, the God of wisdom. All right. Which then also helps to explain Malbim's comment that maybe what the Queen Mother is saying, he can be called Daniel and it won't take away from his Chachma, even though we don't call him by this name that indicates that he has this divine wisdom, right? It's not going to take away from his Chachma, and he'll still be able to tell you the solution. So that was Rashi on that one name. The Al-Sheikh, maybe? I think the Al-Sheikh. So we're going back to talking about it, right? So the Al-Sheikh is fairly long, so I haven't been bringing him too much. I've been bringing a lot of other people, but I haven't been bringing him too much. So it says, the Sarasarisim shatli bo lahagdilam behechal melech. He paid attention. He thought about how to raise them in the palace of the king, but rather how to give them stature, how to make them of greater stature in the king's palace. Ulhorot natan asher nikvam b'shemot haba'alim asher hiktir lehem hamelach v'kol hasarim. Wow. I think there was some kind of problem when the way they get the stuff into Sefaria, it's not that somebody typed it in, they scanned stuff in, but sometimes what they scanned from is messed up because you don't have a mem in the middle of a word. That's not a samach, that's a mem. There's a problem here. All right, I'm not sure what exactly was being said here, but anyway, mashmuto ki okay, I'm hema kedivrei Razal, but I'll call Ela lo gabaliban, lo panu el rahavim abdulat niflaot v'tigal nafsham. Okay. Okay, so I think I got some of the idea about the that maybe he was trying to hide their Jewishness, not force them to assimilate, but to hide their Jewishness. And the other thing that the Al-Sheikh says is that by giving them names like this, which are names of idols, it could have caused them to go down the path of Gaiva. But being who they were, and because they insisted on eating kosher, et cetera, they managed to escape that. Okay. The Al-Sheikh is too long to read and to decipher right now, but he talks about it. But the point is that it was the Sarasari who gave them those names, and evidently not at Nebuchadnezzar's behest, because it wasn't being done for all of the other hostage / youth who were being raised to be officers of the Babylonian court. It was specifically done for these four. The Al-Sheikh Kodesh seemed to indicate that he thought that it was in part, because what happens immediately after this, immediately after he gives them these names, that's when, so then Daniel, right, the Sarasari Sim says, what can I do to help them assimilate, to help them, be more acceptable in the eyes of everybody else? They shouldn't look like they're so different. And the very next thing is Daniel pays attention in order that he shouldn't become disgusting by eating this food of the king and drinking from, possibly something that had been offered to Avodah Zarah. Like, how can he keep himself pure and his friends pure? And so the two things are happening right together. So we learned that back in the fall, but the point is that, did the name come from the Sarasari Sim, or did the name come from Nebuchadnezzar? Or was it a name that was like being given kind of as a nickname thing, and that Daniel himself insisted, just like he insisted on eating kosher, he also insisted on keeping his own name and being known by his own name. If you want to call me that other name as a title, as a whatever, that's your problem. I'll answer, but my name is Daniel, and I think that's why everybody knows his name is Daniel. And he refers to himself throughout in the other parts of the Sefer where he's writing about his own visions, or where he's writing about his own tefillah and stuff. He keeps saying Ana Daniel. He calls himself Daniel. He never calls himself by that other name.
That's what I think, that he calls himself Daniel, but he was known as Belshazzar.
I'm not sure that he was. I'm not sure that he was, because the queen says his name is Daniel. The queen mother knows that his name is Daniel.
But later I saw in chapter 10.
To everybody as Daniel. He was known to everybody as Daniel, who also had this name / title of Belshazzar. But, Malbim suggests that once the name Belshazzar is given to the king's name, then, and before that, the prince's name. So then it's not so appropriate that a mere commoner be called by that same name. And so I'm sure that Daniel was very happy that they quit calling him by that name. But
no, I look forward to chapter 10 and with Koresh. And Koresh came here much later, and there Daniel was introduced also with the name
it's not
Belshazzar,
just
but only to introduce Daniel, who was named Belshazzar.
right, because he was known as Belshazzar. He had been called Belshazzar. That's right, but that's what but if you remember in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar also calls him Daniel.
Yes. So
who I
be...
gave the name Belshazzar to, but nonetheless, he's mostly called Daniel.
He himself, of course.
No, but the chapter 4 was Nebuchadnezzar's letter. It wasn't Daniel's own handwriting. It was Nebuchadnezzar's writing.
Right.
And Nebuchadnezzar, if we go back, okay, so back to chapter 4. In chapter 4, the king says, right, he had this other dream. And the king is right. This is the king's letter to the nation. Right. And he says, and this is after he comes back to himself, right? I had this dream. Everything was great for me. I had this dream. It was a very strange dream. Nobody could explain it to me. I remembered the dream this time. Nobody could explain it to me. Then I remembered, oh, wait a second. I've got this guy in my kingdom who knows how to explain dreams. Let's see, where am I? Right, so he's explaining. So he said, so nobody was able to explain it to me, and va'ad acharin al kadamai, and then after all of them, then entered in before me Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar calls him Daniel. Dishmei Belshazzar, whose name is also, who was also named, or whose title was Belshazzar, like the name of my God. Right? This is what Rashi was quoting. Belshazzar Kashum Eloki, the name of my God. Or Elohi, I guess, because not Hakadosh Baruch Hu. So, but this is not Daniel calling himself Daniel. This is Nebuchadnezzar calling him Daniel. This is Nebuchadnezzar's letter to the people. Nebuchadnezzar calls him Daniel and says, but he also had this name Belshazzar. And then he calls him Belshazzar in the next pasuk, but then later in the same letter, because this whole thing is Nebuchadnezzar's letter. This isn't Daniel's writing. This is Nebuchadnezzar, right? Because it keeps saying, Ana Malka Nebuchadnezzar, I'm the king, Nebuchadnezzar. And you are Belshazzar. You should, okay, so here he calls him Belshazzar. But then but now in the next, right? So he calls him Belshazzar because that's the title, Master of Wisdom, right? And then, but Adain, then Daniel Dishmei Belshazzar, and then Daniel, whose name is also Belshazzar, was Eshtamim Kashai. He stood there for an hour, for some period of time, like not sure how to answer to the king. How to answer, but this is, and then he finally answers. Okay, so he is the king. When he addresses him, does try to address him as Belshazzar, but the king in his letter keeps acknowledging him as Daniel. So they go back and forth between the names. Be interesting to know why Nebuchadnezzar went back and forth between names. And everything that's going to happen, etc. And he gives he gives, right, he gave Nebuchadnezzar that advice according to Chazal. One of the reasons Hatach is understood to be Daniel, right? In the, not just in the, both Targumim identify Hatach as Daniel, but it's also in the Gemara. Hatach in the Esther story is Daniel. And Hatach is killed by Haman. And according to Chazal, I brought the thing from the Gemara a few weeks back, that the Gemara seriously questioned, Chazal seriously questioned the, not just the propriety, but whether it was a good thing or whether it was really a bad thing that Daniel suggested to Nebuchadnezzar that he could put off this decree by giving tzedakah. To the extent that one of the explanations for why HaKadosh Baruch Hu allowed Haman or appointed Haman to kill Daniel was that it was a punishment for his having offered Nebuchadnezzar the advice, like, how to get around God's decree. But and then when Nebuchadnezzar decides, it's like, oh, fine, yeah, fine, I'll give tzedakah. And then when it depends on, at some point he either gets so full of himself or he takes a look at how much is going out to tzedakah and he's like, I didn't count on that. But actually, that's the way one person explained it to me. But the pshat here is that his gaiva got the better of him again, right? And when the gaiva got the better of him again, and he's like, I don't need this business of taking care of the poor. Like, what does that have to do with anything? I'm top of the world. And the minute that he did that, then the decree hit in full. The minute that he, questioned the value and the continuation of the tzedakah, and the tzedakah was meant to help him understand that he needed to see himself as subordinate to God, as, not the one who was in charge of the world, because Akash Baruch Hu was in charge of the world, and to see himself as Akash Baruch Hu in the name of, not in Daniel, but I think either in Yirmiyah or Cheskel, I think it's in Yirmiyah, is called Avdi Nebuchadnezzar. The Akash Baruch Hu speaks of Nebuchadnezzar and calls him my servant. But when he got too full of himself, then he got cut down. That was the whole point of that previous chapter. But even there, Nebuchadnezzar was still recognizing the stuff with the name. All right. Let me go down to where we were. So Daniel comes, and now he's going to be called Daniel. And he gets shown the handwriting on the wall. He gets told what the reward is going to be. And he says, I really don't care about your gifts. Keep them. And then he goes through a history of what the various different things that happened with Nebuchadnezzar, and says, and you're like, and why are you giving the king a history lesson? He wants you to explain what's there written on the wall. And so Daniel says to him, and you're his son, Belshazzar, but lo hishpelt levav. You didn't lower your heart. You called kavel di called denayadata. Even though you knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, right? That he lost his mind, that he was like an animal for 7 years until he understood that it's Kadosh Baruch Hu who runs the world and not he himself. You didn't learn from that at all. Va'ameri Shmaya Hitramanta, and you tried to like lift yourself up, as it were, over the God of heaven. Ulumanyaya dibete haitiv kadamach, and you had the kalim of his house, in other words, the Beit HaMikdash, brought before you. Va'ant v'rav shaglatach natach Chamra Shatin Bahon, and you and your chieftains, your concubines and your wives. It's like, wait a minute, what are you doing with both concubines and wives together at the same place? I mean, it's just it's a balagan that's going on there, and they're drunk, okay, and they were drinking the wine out of the kalim. And not only that, the Lekei Kaspa, the Hav and Achasha, Parzala, Avna, to gods of silver, Kesef, you see, the Hava, the Daled Zion, gold, Nachasha, like Nachoshet, the copper, Farzala, because although actually, good question. Now, they have the letter Bet, but Barzel and Farzel, okay, is the more interesting one. This is the word for wood. Va'avna Evan, and of stone. All these idols. And Daniel then says about those idols, Dala chazin v'la shamim. They don't see and they don't hear, right? We have that in Tehillim, right? V'la yadin shabachta. Right? And they don't know anything, and that those are the ones that you're praising. But lelaka di nishmatach bidei v'kol orchotachle la hadarta. But to God, okay, who that your soul is in his hand, and all of your ways, everything that happens to you belongs to him, right? He's in charge of all of that. You did not give honor. Now, this linguistically is an interesting thing that's going on here. Usually in Aramaic, hadar is actually the word chazar. So I wonder, most of the Rav Steinsaltz's Perush and others that I've seen, the word in Hebrew, the shorish in Hebrew, Hey Daled Reish, is like hidur. It's to give honor, to give kavod, to be splendid, right? And so I wonder, Daniel himself is writing. And I wonder whether, as both a Hebrew and an Aramaic speaker, if he did not deliberately make a play on words here, because you didn't return to him. In other words, you didn't do tshuva, lo hadarta, if it's Aramaic, or lo hadarta, you didn't give kavod, you didn't give hidur to him. So it struck me as being very interesting. Now, he's just said, your soul is in his hand. They have just seen this hand that with nothing attached to it, like just the hand, but there's no body attached to it at all, right? The hand writing on the wall. And so, so the next thing that Daniel says, the Ramat Valley pointed this out. The next thing that Daniel says is the following: B'dayin min kadmohi shliach pasa di yada. Then from before him, meaning him, God, was sent this hand. The pasa is this part of the hand, the kaf yad, okay? Uktava dana rishim, and that writing was inscribed. And it wrote, Tava, it wrote, that hand which is doing the shlichut of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Don't think, Daniel is saying, that the hand, that when I say to you, your soul is in his hand, that I meant that hand that you saw writing on the wall. Okay? Because God doesn't have physical hands. All right? What you saw was a form of shlichut, of a messenger, as it were. And he can create it for the need of the moment, but that's not his hand that you saw. All right? And it wrote that inscription. And now, finally, after giving this tochacha, and I'm like thinking to myself, how come he's still standing there? Like, you don't talk to a king that way. You know, like, how are you getting away with this? Even if you think that, you know, that this writing on the wall is the death knell, but still, you could be dead before the king is, if he takes this the wrong way. And everybody's just sitting there mum. We don't have any sense that people are upset that he's speaking to the king in this way. At any rate, he now turns to the inscription that's on the wall, and he says, Udnak tavadi rishim many tekel ufarsi. And this that was written, this, the writing of this inscription, this is how you read it. The words are mene tekel ufarsi. Dnaf shar milta. And here's the explanation. Here's the solution of the matter. Mene rather means, even though it's repeated twice, mene means mena elaka malchutach v'hashlameh. God has like appointed your kingdom, your dynasty, the whole dynasty of the Kasdim, and also you personally, and Hashlameh, and when it's going to be complete. So, Mene, from the beginning, you got appointed to being king, or Bavel comes on to the world stage because God made that appointment, but also God appointed the conclusion of it, and that budget of time that was set aside for Bavel is coming now to its close. But God appointed it from the very beginning, the beginning and the end. And so that's the Mene. Tekel, he says, this is the language of Tekilta. There's a taf shin switch between Aramaic and Hebrew. So shakalta, you were weighed, b'moznaya, you were weighed in the moznayim, the balance scales. Okay, you were weighed in the balance scales. V'hishtachakta chasir, and you were found lacking. Peres, this ufarsin, and actually he gives two meanings for it. Peres is prisat malchutach. Your kingdom is like torn, like lifros lechem is to slice bread, is like sliced away from you. V'yehivat l'madai ufaras, and I am giving, and it is given, v'yehivat, and it is given to madai ufaras. So the peres, that's why it's ufarsin. There are two meanings for peres. There's prisat, that the kingdom is sliced away from you, and also it's given to Madai Ufaras, it's given to the Medes and the Persians. And so we have Farsin. So we have the two meanings of it. So Daniel goes through, he tells him what it says, and he gives him bing, 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 the meaning of the words. And then, V'dain Amar Belshazzar, V'halbishu l'Daniel Argvana, V'hamnicha didahava al tzavre. So then Belshazzar says, okay, right? So dress Daniel in the royal purple and place this collar, this necklet of gold around his neck. V'hachrizu Elohi di lahave shalit talta b'malchuta, and cause to be announced before him or about him that he is going to be the ruler of a third of the kingdom. Okay, so Belshazzar is keeping his word. It was one of the shortest being in charge of a third of the kingdom that ever happened to anybody, because Be Belelia Katil Belshazzar Malka Kasta. Because on that very night, Belshazzar was killed. Ta-da! That's the end of that chapter. It's like this whole big buildup. Daniel gives an explanation as to what the words mean. Belshazzar keeps his word, which may be one of the few good things that we know about him. And then he gets killed that night. And the Medes and the Persians take over. So how much time do I have? I have some time. All right. So the first thing I want to do is I want to switch the share and go take a look at Ramat Valley on the meaning of the tekel, the many tekel ufarsin. So he suggests that we should take a look. I mean, first of all, there's clearly Daniel's explanation, which is a correct explanation. But the Ramat Valley gives us a deeper way of looking at it, which I will share with you. Not that I fully understand, but, that's Ramat Valley. And he says, V'tireh, sheyesh b'ktav hazeh, 4 words. And 2 of them are the same, if you pay attention, right? So he says, perhaps these are in parallel. So here he's not saying, but perhaps they're in parallel. I think in one place he does, that it's in parallel to God's name, right? But he says, perhaps these are in parallel to the 4 levels of Riticha is like a chariot, de masavuta of Tuma, Shenafla, that fell below Tkuma without any hope of arising again in the Malchut of the casting. That they're right. And not only that, but there were 15 letters. If you go back and look at Mene, Tekel, so that's 333, that's 9. Ufarsin is another 6. Altogether is 15 letters. Okay, so it's the 15 letters, which he says that's paralleling the Yud and the He of the holy name, which is Shehen Sod Ha-Elyonot Shebaot Mitzidan Kol Gzerot El Tachtonim. So there's, like I said, this is getting a little above my pay grade here, but there's the notion that the Yud and the He is the name of the Shefa coming down, if it's Shefa, but also of Gzerot coming down. And the Vav and the He is the Or Choser. The Vav and the He is the fullness, not just how God runs the world, as it were, from the outside, but also from the inside, and how we show it. And so we're waiting for the fullness of the name, right? On that day, God's name is one. God is one, will be recognized as one, not just the God up there, but the God that works within history, both together. Okay. And God is one and his name is one. But right now he's saying this is just opposite the Yud and the He, which is this secret of the upper power, that all of these Gzerot come from them down below. And besod, meaning in Kabbalah, etc. And so it's sod, merachok, emunah, uman. So if you think I understood that, you would be wrong. So we're not even going to try that one. Lama lo hizkir et teva haravi'it kichtava. So so then he goes back and he says, why was it that when Daniel was explaining the fourth word, why didn't he explain it the way it was written? Because it was written Farsi. And he said Perez. And he explained Perez on Prisat. And also, like I said, Perez and my suggestion is that it was plural, and he was actually explaining it to be plural. He was explaining it both on Prisat and on Paras, and on Persia. But the Ramadvali says you should know that the Hatam Ha'ikari Nir'eh Le'aniyut Da'anti, okay, the main reason, the principal reason, in my humble opinion, Lefi she paras, this word, or peres, those three letters are the same letters as Sefer or Sapir. Okay, v'oleh k'minyan, and if you add them up, so it's 60 and 80 is 140, and 200 is 340. And so that's the same gematria as Shem or Sham, either one, which is the secret level of Malchut Shemayim, Shnikret Shem, and Sefer Kiyudua. Whenever somebody says, as is known, I'm like, right, not to me, it's not known, but it's known, okay? And when we talk about the name being one, right? So, but that's also the Sefer, right? And that's that this Preda and Prisa of the Malchut of the casting into its parts, it got torn apart, and part of it got given to Paras and part of it got given to Madai, right? That all of the dinim come from that place, in the place of the din of heaven, which is din, dina de malchuta dina. So he says the secret of dina de malchuta dina. Dina de malchuta dina is a phrase in Chazal that usually means that you have to obey the law of the land. The law of the land, the law of the kingdom is the law. He's using it in its secret meaning, right? In other words, the meaning in terms of Chachmat Nistar, of that the Dina de Malchuta of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Melech, Malchei Amlachim, that's the din. Not that that's the law, but that's the judgment that's being made. Okay, so part of it was accessible to us, and part of it was not so accessible to us. But he had this thing about the four words, and I want to share, go back over to this one. Because I wanted to see, some of the other mefarshim on. Let me take a look. Oh, the Al-Sheikh is too long. I'm not doing. Take a look at. Wow. The Chida brings about this where he said perpetuates, which almost sounds like a command form, by the way. Prisat malchutach, v'yahavid l'medayu faras, that literally the king his head was sliced off, and it was given to Darivesh and Koresh. What he says is that Chazal said that one of the officers who was supposed to be like a bodyguard kind of person, after he heard Daniel's nevuah, thought to himself, wow, clearly Daniel's words are absolutely correct. So instead of being the king's bodyguard, he killed the king, and he sliced off his head, and he took the head, and he went out from the city, and he took the head to Koresh and Darivesh, right? To Bihavi, the Malchutach, the king's head was given to Madai and Faraz, and who were, at that time, they were warring against Bavel. And because they saw that the king of the Kasdim was now dead, that gave them sort of like the Holofernes story or the Sisera story, where the king's head gets cut off, or the leader's head gets cut off, and then it gets displayed, and then that takes the heart out of the people who are on his side and gives strength to the people who are on the other side. It's a story that repeats itself through history. So that's an interesting medrash that's brought on that particular word. Talking about how the conquest actually took place, I read in the Steinsaltz parish to Sefer Daniel, that what happened here, I'm going to just stop the share, that what happened was the Persians and the Medes were fighting to take over control of the empire. Belshazzar was a very weak king anyway, but the main city of Bavel was too strong for them to overcome. And so it's like, well, I'm an American, so I know about this in the United States. There was such terrible pollution in Lake Erie and some other places, but whatever, that there was stuff that was floating on top of the water was burning. Like, the water below wasn't burning. It's not that the water was burning, but there was so much pollution and stuff on top that it like caught on fire and it burnt for quite a while before they could get it put out. And evidently that's what Koresh did, was that, we know there's oil in that part of the world. He he basically set the Euphrates River on fire, which not only meant that the Euphrates River went through this main city. And so it not only basically made this wall of fire between the parts of the city, et cetera, so that the defenders were having a much harder time being able to get to where they needed to go on the inside. But it also lowered the water level temporarily, which then gave the Persians a way of attacking the city, of getting into the city, because that was part of the defenses of the city, was that they had this water part to it. And once the water level went down, so the Persians were able to come in through there. I don't know how they managed to get through the fire, but anyway, they were then able to come in through there, and they were able to take over the city. And that's, it was just like, it's a description of war. And of course, with what's going on in the world right now, it's like, war was never pretty. And it was pretty horrible before and now. Anyway, so I don't know that there are any easy answers to any of that. But that's the end of this chapter. Chazal tell us that one of the reasons that Belshazzar was throwing this crazy party and brought out the Kalim of the Beit HaMikdash was that he figured the 70 years were up, and look at that, we're still here. Well, the 70 years of Bavel were in fact up, and that was the end of him. Right then and there, that was the end, because the 70 years were up. But as we saw in the first, not in the first chapter, in the 9th chapter, back in Elul, it turns out that Yirmiyahu had two different nevuot, both of which spoke of 70 years. One of them was 70 years of Bavel, and that was up. The other was 70 years of the destruction. And that's not up until for another 18 years later. So there are people who try to do things with the numbers to say, oh, well, they were counting. Sometimes they were counting years twice because one king stopped being the king, whatever, the dynasty succession in the dynasty. So one person died and the other person started. And because they always count a new year for the king, either in Nisan or in Tishrei or whenever it is, but there's a fixed date on which it becomes the next year. And even if the person had only ruled for a few days before that all of a sudden now it's the second year. And so maybe they got extra years in that way. But I think the easier explanation is that everybody knew about Yirmiyahu's nevuot, but the one nevuah that was 70 years to Bavel, and the other nevuah that was 70 years from the Chorban, and that those aren't, and it's not, the language isn't clear that it's from the Chorban. It's only clear in retrospect that that's what it is. But it's because of errors of knowing when the start date for the 70 is. that that it becomes kind of dicey. And I said to somebody, and I'm sure I'll say it again in this class, is that I think that a lot of the visions and nevuot that we're given about end of days is to tell us that that history will have a happy ending. It's not to tell us we can calculate when the end is going to be. That's not in our hands. But it's to tell us that history will have a happy ending and that we shouldn't give up hope and that we should do everything that we can to make the journey from here to there as kind a journey and beautiful a journey as we can. Anyway, so I'm going to stop